Have you ever wondered who's actually behind the wheel of the economy? Today, we're going to crack open the government's toolbox and take a look at the powerful and sometimes really imperfect tools they use to try and steer this massive, complicated machine.
And that's the big question, isn't it? Do governments really have levers they can pull to fine-tune everything? Or are they, and all of us, just along for a wild ride? To figure that out, we first have to pop the hood and see how this whole economic engine actually works. So, before we can even talk about steering, we have to understand what makes the engine run. And at its core, it's really all about the huge forces of supply and demand playing out on a national scale. Let's start with the supply side. Now, aggregate supply isn't just one factory or one company. It's the total productive power of the entire country. It's the sum of every single thing we can make or do, every product, every service, every app, every single road we build.
But here's the catch. There's a hard limit to how much an economy can produce. In the long run, our output is capped by real things. How many workers we have, our level of technology, our infrastructure. You can't just wish for more. That's why on a graph, economists just draw this potential as a straight vertical line. It represents our economic speed limit, our maximum sustainable output. And this leads to the million-dollar question for anyone trying to run an economy. What happens when you try to floor it when the engine is already redlining? When people and governments are trying to spend more, but the country's already producing everything it possibly can, where does that extra demand actually go?
And here's the blunt answer. When an economy's already at full capacity, just throwing more money at it doesn't magically create more stuff. Companies can't just hire more people that don't exist or build new factories overnight. So, what do? They raise prices. The result? Inflation.
This is exactly where that famous textbook idea, the multiplier effect, completely breaks down. You know, the idea that government spending can create even more growth? Well, that works when you have idle resources. But when the engine is already screaming at its limit, that extra money just becomes hot air. It has nowhere productive to go, so it just pushes up prices.
Okay, so knowing those limits, what can the government actually do to influence things? This is where we get into fiscal policy, which is really just a fancy term for government spending and taxes.
So if you want to shift that vertical line, if you want to actually raise the economy's speed limit, what works? Well, the toolbox has a few options. Lowering taxes can encourage businesses to invest. Cutting red tape can make it easier to build and innovate. And of course, investing in better infrastructure helps everyone be more productive. But notice what isn't a tool for this. Just giving people money. That boosts demand, the spending side, not our fundamental ability to produce more things. All right, let's flip the script. What if the problem is the opposite? What if there's too much demand, too much money chasing too few goods? The economy is overheating and inflation is starting to get scary. What tool do you pull out of the box then?
Well, the logic is pretty simple. If too much spending is the problem, the solution is less spending. The government can do that by either cutting its own spending directly or by raising taxes, which leaves all of us with less money to spend. It's really like tapping the brakes on the economic engine.
This brings us to two very different ways of thinking about government budgets. The old school approach is the annually balanced budget. The rule is simple: never spend more than you take in. But a more modern view, functional finance, says, wait a second. The goal isn't to balance the budget just for the sake of it. The real goal is to balance the economy. That means using the budget as a tool, running deficits when times are tough and surpluses when things are overheating to hit those real targets of full employment and stable prices.
So, let's say the government decides to run a deficit, to spend more money than it's bringing in through taxes. This raises a pretty basic question. Where does that extra money actually come from? To figure that out, we have to look at the financial plumbing of the economy.
It comes from what economists call the market for loanable funds. Now, this isn't a physical place. It's a concept that represents the massive collective pool of all the savings in an economy that's available to be borrowed. This is the money that fuels everything from a tech startup's big idea to a city's new bridge. And where does this giant pool of cash come from? Well, it comes from savers. Every single dollar that you, me, or a company puts away instead of spending goes into this fund, making it available for someone else to borrow and invest.
But you can probably see a potential problem here. That pool of savings is limited. Private businesses need to borrow from it to expand, to innovate, to create jobs. So what happens when the government suddenly wades into that pool and needs to borrow a massive amount to fund a big deficit?
In a typical year, most of the borrowing from this pool is done by private companies. They're the ones using that capital to build and grow. The government's borrowing is usually a much smaller slice of the pie.
But when the government starts running a huge deficit, its borrowing needs can explode. And since the total pool of savings hasn't necessarily gotten any bigger, the government's borrowing can literally start to squeeze out private companies. It becomes a competition for a limited resource, which tends to drive up interest rates and make it more expensive for businesses to get the loans they need.
And there's a name for this. It's called crowding out. It's one of the key trade-offs of deficit spending. Because while the government spending might be stimulating one part of the economy, its heavy borrowing can simultaneously choke off the private investment that's so crucial for long-term growth.
So far, this all might sound like a pretty neat and tidy instruction manual. Problem? Pull a lever. Solution. But in the real world, using these tools is incredibly messy. It's time to read the fine print.
Okay, problem number one is huge. Policymakers are essentially driving by looking in the rearview mirror. The economic data they use to make these massive decisions is often months old by the time they get it. And to make things even worse, it frequently gets revised later. This delay is called the information lag.
And that's just the beginning of the delays. After they get the old data, there's the recognition lag, the time it takes for everyone to agree there's even a problem. Then comes the decision lag, politics, the endless debate over what to do. And even after they finally make a decision, there's the implementation lag, the time it actually takes for that policy to get rolled out and start affecting the real world.
So here's the bottom line. When you stack all of these lags on top of each other, you run a very real risk that the government's solution arrives long after the problem has changed or maybe even fixed itself. You could end up hitting the gas right as the economy is already speeding up on its own, or slamming the brakes just as it's heading for a slowdown.
So, this is what we're left with. We have this powerful toolbox, but the tools are slow, they have serious side effects, and they're operated using a fuzzy picture of the past. It forces us to ask a really fundamental question. Is the goal of economic policy to be a master puppeteer, trying to pull every single string just right? Or is it maybe more like being a gardener? You can't force growth, but you can create the right conditions. Good soil, enough water, plenty of sunlight for a healthy system that you can influence, but maybe never truly control.